So if we think about the broader narratives, actually, I mean, it's quite useful to think about Putin's State of the Nation address just a couple of days ago, because that was really a tour de force of all the old favorites, from sort of Western gender neutral militants to refighting World War II. But it was also oddly coherent in the sense that actually the narrative since the conflict began in its first phase in 2014, the narrative hasn't changed that much. I mean, you have this idea that banderovцы, which is a term used to denote Nazi collaborators in Russian, have seized power and that they are Western puppets and that real Ukrainians are just waiting for Big Brother Russia to rescue them. And, you know, any Russian intervention is just a restoration of historical lands and defense of Russian speakers. And it's a defensive war against the West that's trying to use Ukraine to destroy Russia. And these have been quite consistent. I think that's an element. I think often if we just sort of zone in and out from our Western perspective into these narratives, they seem, you know, perhaps slightly unhinged. But if you think that actually this has been the context for almost a decade in which many Russians, you know, of the information environment for many Russians, and not just in the media and news, but in the films they watch, in the television dramas, in the historical documentaries where Ukrainians are constantly depicted as, you know, Nazis or treacherous, or at best as yokels who need a strong Russian steering hand.
Yeah, it is interesting because, you know, toward the end of last year, you got the sense that some of the Russian media were reporting some of the difficulties of the war, however they were portraying the war. This year it seems to have swung fully back to your point, the sort of gay Nazis threatening to overthrow Russia's very way of life. How ingrained, to your point, if that's been going now for nearly a decade, how ingrained is it in people, and do they really believe it?
I mean, the question of do people really believe it is always a very tricky one. But to the extent that we can see maybe a different, if you would allow me, if I could phrase it as, do these narratives resonate? You know, do people kind of buy into them broadly? Maybe not into every single aspect of them, but into sort of the broader point. Yes, they do. And the Kremlin selected these narratives because they already had broad appeal within Russian society, and then it kind of used that appeal and manipulated it and used it towards its own end. There are as well still quite a lot of quite critical opinions that you can easily find in Russia. I mean, the environment is tightly controlled on television, but you know, on Telegram, which 40 million, like almost one in three Russians use, you have complete access to uncensored information. And there's a lot of criticism of the war, but the most popular Telegram channels, which I say again is completely uncensored, and I'm sure it's monitored, but it's not controlled in any way.
That is interesting. Because you do get the feeling that if there is opposition, it's not just information manipulation. Those who oppose this view sometimes face imprisonment, and in the case of some of the oligarchs, just mysterious disappearances. So there's a cost if you openly defy the Kremlin's view of the world.
Well, there is, of course, horrible costs, and we see that Alexei Navalny is suffering that. But most of the criticism of the war that happens actually comes from the people who want the war to be fought more effectively and waged more brutally. The liberal opposition, and I'm very sad to say this, is not representative of the country in the same way that the real extremists, you know, who want to go out and sort of commit genocide, they're also not representative. The vast majority of Russians essentially just want to be left alone and are happy to approve of the war up until the point that it starts to really, or at least put up with the war up until the point that it affects their lives. So it's not really possible to talk of, you know, this widespread Russian support for the war. It's more of a kind of acquiescence, agreeing to it.
Yeah, sort of just putting up with it and trying to get on with life as best they can. It is an interesting point that you make, because I think few people would understand that there is such widely sort of debated or available information that's an alternative to what Putin puts up. Is it the fact that we are fed, you know, like that concert hosted by Putin last night with many people speaking about their love for him and their support for him? Is it that almost the images are controlled for us too?
Yes, and I mean those events, they are obviously they're completely stage managed. And one of the interesting things about the Kremlin, and I know everybody likes a good World War II analogy, including Putin himself, and of
Yes.
course that's great. But people often like to make these comparisons, with sort of militaristic fascism, but it's much more of a sort of Potemkin propaganda piece. I mean, they've arrested people who've protested for the war or not protested but come out and demonstrated in support of the war, as well as people who, of course, they've arrested 19,000 different people have been detained, not arrested but detained, protests against the war. So that's an interesting point, because really what the Kremlin wants to do is it wants to be able to control the narrative, and if you have people who are true believers, they're often quite uncontrollable.
It's really interesting perspective. Tell us, Jade, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, sort of tried to talk about managing Russia, not crushing Russia. I wonder if there's something to be said for his views that, this very existential threat that Putin feels from the West, it seems to be deeply held by him. Is that your observation?
Yes, I think it is, but I think partly that's because he's completely conflated himself with the country. And his own elite, his own interests and the interests of the elite with those of the country, which I think are not the same thing, quite clearly, because it's in Putin's it's in Putin's interest to continue this war. It's quite clearly not in the interest of the Russian people to continue this war. So they're very separate things, and I think we have to be careful. We were just talking then, and you made that very important point about the extent to which we're also being fed and manipulated slightly with some of the images. And I do find it, as somebody who spent a long time living in Russia, and I still very much love Russia, and all of my Russian friends, with whom I'm still in contact, the idea that Putin is that his views and what's good for Putin is good for Russia, to me seems a very flawed statement.
Yeah, disjointed. Really good to get your perspective on this, Jade. Thanks so much.
Thank you.